Good morning. I'm happy to be here on this memorial of Saint Thérèse. And I would want to share with you this morning something, or a dimension of her life that is little known. I find Thérèse to be someone whose name, or whose moniker, the Little Flower, is a little bit misleading because it kind of denotes that she was this simple, happy, peaceful little girl and young woman. But although she was surrounded by love all her life, she was very, very intense in her own way. From an early age, she got to know Jesus and got to love him deeply and knew that she wanted to be a Carmelite nun. And so as she grew older, her sister Pauline actually was the first to enter the Carmelite life. And that was devastating for Thérèse because at age 4, her mother passed away, and Thérèse entered into a deep depression, and she more or less adopted her sister Pauline as her mother. So when Pauline left to join the Carmelite convent in Lisieux, Thérèse again was devastated and went through a very, very difficult time. But fast forwarding the tape, she eventually even went to Rome to petition Pope Leo at that time to become a Carmelite and to get his permission to do so because she was so young. She was only 15. And when she went before the Pope, as was typical, you aren't supposed to say anything. But what Thérèse did, she just outright blurted out, "Holy Father, would you give me permission to enter the Carmelite life?" And so the Pope was taken aback somewhat. And he said to her, "Well, do whatever your superiors tell you." So Thérèse was very disappointed, hoping that she would have the Pope's permission to join. But that didn't deter her in the least. So eventually, at age 15, she was allowed to join she got permission from the local bishop to join the Carmel. And on September 8th of 1890, she was finally professed as a Carmelite nun. And then a short while later, in 1897, she died a horrible death, suffering from tuberculosis. So she was only 24 years old. And she never left the convent. She never traveled widely, once she entered the cloister. But her impact on the world is remarkable. And thanks to her sisters and the nuns that lived with her, who asked her to please write down her memoirs, we have this legacy of Thérèse that was left for all of us. So I want to share with you, however, among the many things I can share, a dimension of Thérèse that is probably little known. Thérèse and her sisters actually were all very, very artistic. Thérèse painted beautifully, as did her sister Celine, her sister Marie. But one of the things that really, that I find most intriguing is her poetry. She wrote 53 some odd poems in her lifetime. And one of the last ones she wrote, which was roughly written 4 years before her death, was called An Unpetaled Rose. And the unpetaled rose was an apt image for Thérèse because she herself was failing, and she always had this association with flowers, and she would realize that flowers, whether they were grand, big, beautiful flowers or little tiny ones, the sun shined on all of them and God gave life to all of them. And so Thérèse identified with all of nature, but particularly with flowers and especially with roses. And it was a tradition in the Carmel of Lisieux that when Thérèse became a mistress of novices, they would go to the garden where there was a crucifix, and they would pick up the rose petals that had fallen off the rose bushes, and they would gather them together, and they would lay them at the crucifix before the Lord. And I actually have a picture of it that I'm going to hand out to everyone. This is a picture of Thérèse and her novices strewing flowers at the base of the crucifix. So back to the poem. So towards the end of her life, her reputation started to get around, and a Mother Superior in the Carmel in Paris heard about Thérèse. Now this woman, her name was Mother Henrietta. She was very, very sick, and she was deathly afraid of dying. And she went into a deep depression, entered a dark night of the soul, a deep, dark spiritual time. And when she heard about Thérèse, she had asked one of the sisters to ask Thérèse if she would write a poem for her. So Thérèse took that and she went with it. And the poem, again, became an image of her. She was actually describing herself in this poem. And towards the end of it, Thérèse, well, I'll read it to you shortly, but Thérèse really felt that that unpetaled rose, again, represented suffering and sacrificing, and something that was offered as something beautiful for Jesus. So once Mother Henrietta got the poem, she thought it was great, but she wrote back to the convent and said, ask Thérèse to write another verse where God gathers all these unpetaled roses and puts them together in heaven to form a beautiful, glorious rose. And to this, Thérèse, she really didn't like that idea. And this was her response to that request. She said, let that good mother write those verses herself as she thinks best. As for me, I am not inspired to do so. My wish is to be an unpetaled flower forever, to make God happy, period. That is all. So there you get a sense of Thérèse and her strength of character. Again, being called a little flower, which is what she's really known as, it's a beautiful title, but it's a little deceptive because Thérèse was more of a warrior for Christ. Her whole Carmelite life was dedicated to prayer, especially for priests and to save all souls. So with that, let me just read you this beautiful poem called An Unpetaled Rose by Thérèse. Jesus, when I see you held by your mother, leaving her arms, trying, trembling, your first steps on our sad earth, before you, I'd like to unpetal a rose in its freshness, so that your little foot may rest ever so softly on a flower. This unpetaled rose is the faithful image, divine child, of the heart that wants to sacrifice itself for you unreservedly at each moment. Lord, on your altars, more than one new rose likes to shine. It gives itself to you, but I dream of something else, to be unpetaled. The rose in its splendor can adorn your feast, lovable child, but the unpetaled rose is just flung out to blow away. An unpetaled rose gives itself unaffectedly to be no more. Like it, with joy, I abandon myself to you, little Jesus. One walks on rose petals with no regrets, and this debris is a simple ornament that one disposes of artlessly. That I've understood. Jesus, for your love, I've squandered my life, my future. In the eyes of men, a rose forever withered. I must die. For you, I must die, child. Beauty supreme. What a blessed fate. In being unpetaled, I want to prove to you that I love you, oh my treasure. Under your baby steps, I want to live here below with mystery. And I'd like to soften once more on Calvary, your last steps. Very, very powerful imagery. So I hope that hearing this beautiful poem by Thérèse will inspire each one of us to be unpetaled in our own way, to offer up little sacrifices, whatever they may be, for the love of Christ, that we too may soften once more on Calvary, his last steps. Amen.